Let me tell you a story about a man who believed hope was a goddamn liar. A story about a tomb disguised as a mansion, and the two little ghosts who haunted its halls. But before we descend into that silence, I have to ask you, do you believe a single person can truly bring a family back from the dead? Let us know in the comments below. And if you feel that chill down your spine, that pull of a story about to unfold, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. You're not going to want to miss a second of this. Julian Vance had come to believe one unshakable truth. Hope was a goddamn liar. It was a phantom that whispered promises in the dead of night only to vanish at dawn, leaving behind an emptiness colder than before. His life was a testament to its betrayal. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe, yet within the walls of his own sprawling estate on the wind-swept coast of Maine, he was nothing more than a ghost keeper, a warden of a prison built from grief. The Vance mansion wasn't a home. It was a sepulcher, impeccably clean, artfully decorated, and utterly devoid of life. Laughter hadn't echoed off its vaulted ceilings in 5 years, not since the day his wife, Eleanor, had given him 2 perfect sons, and then slipped away, leaving behind a silence so absolute it had a physical weight. Leo and Miles, his beautiful, broken boys, had been born into that silence. Deaf from birth, they had never heard their mother's voice. And since her death, they seemed to have retreated into a world no one, least of all Julian, could penetrate. They were 5 years old now, twin shadows with their mother's eyes, who moved through the cavernous rooms like phantoms, their gazes lowered, their hands still. Toys sat untouched in pristine playrooms. Therapists came and went, armed with charts and theories, leaving behind hefty invoices and the same hollow silence they'd found. Julian believed nothing could reach them. He believed they were lost to him, another promise broken by a cruel and indifferent universe, until she arrived. Clara May, a woman with no prestigious titles, no academic accolades, and a warmth that seemed utterly out of place in the cold Maine air. She was just the new housekeeper, hired to manage the tomb. But in the quiet thunder of her presence, something was about to shatter. One song, one clumsy dance in a sun-drenched kitchen, one moment of unbridled joy is about to rip through 5 years of sorrow. But what happens when breaking the silence is only the beginning? What happens when the sound of healing is more terrifying than the silence ever was? Stick with us. You're about to find out how life can bloom in the most desolate of places. Clara had been in the Vance mansion for just over 2 weeks, and in that time, she'd learned the language of the house. It was a language of tiptoes on polished marble, of doors closing with a soft, apologetic click, of meals eaten without a single word. It was the language of profound, suffocating sorrow. The boys, Leo and Miles, were like delicate porcelain dolls left on a shelf. They rarely made eye contact, preferring to exist in a small, shared bubble of quiet observation. They would sit for hours, their small hands resting in their laps, lost in a world she couldn't see. And Julian Vance. He was more of a specter than a father, a tall, imposing figure who moved between his cavernous office and the upstairs wing like a storm cloud, his face a mask of controlled indifference. His words were rare, precise, and stripped of all emotion. He was a man drowning in plain sight, and he'd taken his children down with him. That morning was no different. The air was thick with unspoken grief. As Clara prepared lunch, a deep frustration began to build in her chest, a rebellion against the stillness. She had grown up in a house bursting with noise, a chaotic symphony of laughter, arguments, and music that filled every corner with life. The Vance mansion felt like a vacuum, sucking the very soul out of the air. On impulse, a sudden, undeniable urge, she stood in the vast, sterile kitchen and watched the twins sit at their small table, their faces blank. She reached into the worn canvas bag she always carried and pulled out a small, battered Bluetooth speaker. She didn't think, she just acted. She pressed play, a crackle, then the powerful, soul-shaking voice of Aretha Franklin flooded the room. The melody was a river of warmth, a living, breathing thing full of grit and glory. Clara expected nothing. Maybe a flicker of annoyance from the boys, or perhaps they wouldn't notice at all. But instead, the universe tilted. Leo looked up first, his dark brows furrowing. His small lips parted as if to form a question he didn't know how to ask. Miles, sitting beside him, blinked rapidly, a quick, startled motion. Then his heel began to tap a soft, unsteady rhythm against the leg of his chair. The sound wasn't just sound. It was vibration. It was a pulse traveling through the floorboards, up their chairs, into their small bodies. It was a language they didn't need ears to understand. Clara's heart didn't just jump, it exploded in her chest. A giggle, small and fragile as a soap bubble, escaped from Leo's lips. Her instincts screamed at her, "Don't stop! Whatever you do, don't stop!" She placed the speaker on the granite countertop and began to sway her hips, her movements loose and playful, an exaggeration of joy. "Come on, little men," she said, her voice bright and teasing, knowing the meaning wasn't in her words but in the energy pouring from her. She moved closer, swinging her arms to the beat, spinning once in a clumsy, happy circle. Leo tilted his head, a scientist observing a strange new phenomenon. Then he mimicked her, rocking his small torso forward and back. Miles slapped his tiny hands on the tabletop, the percussive sound startling him into another giggle. He slid clumsily from his chair and stood, his knees wobbly, his eyes wide with an emotion so raw it looked like joy. Clara gasped, covering it with a laugh, and clapped her hands to encourage him. "That's it, sweetheart. Yes, just like that." She twirled again, letting her long braids fly out around her. When she glanced back, she saw Leo sliding down from his seat too, a fierce look of determination on his face. He would not be left behind. Their movements were awkward, unsteady, a million miles from graceful, but it didn't matter. They were moving. They were reacting. They were alive in a way she had not seen since she'd arrived. She knelt, bringing herself down to their level, dancing on her knees, her smile so wide it made her cheeks ache. Leo's giggles grew louder, a sound that seemed to bounce off his brother's shy, eager attempts to copy her. Miles stomped his little feet, and his laughter, thin, high-pitched but undeniably real, sent a sharp, beautiful ache through Clara's chest. She decided to push, to test the fragile, miraculous bond forming in that kitchen. She bent low, picked up Miles's small hands, and guided them side to side, leading him in a simple dance. He stiffened for a second, then melted into her touch, his wide eyes glowing with pride as he looked up at her. Leo, feeling left out, tugged at her skirt, his impatience a beautiful, living thing. She freed one hand and took his, swaying with both boys, a strange, perfect trio on a stage only they could see. "See? We're dancing. You can feel it, can't you?" she whispered, knowing it was her expression, her touch, that carried the weight of her words. They laughed again, clear and unguarded. The sound was contagious. Leo attempted a spin, a clumsy whirl that sent him tumbling, but Clara caught him, steadying him, lifting him back upright. "You're all right, baby. Try again." She exaggerated a spin of her own, and this time both boys clapped, a sharp, imperfect rhythm that faintly matched the soulful beat pouring from the speaker. For 5 years, they had ignored everything. Expensive toys, bespoke games, the well-meaning attempts of a dozen specialists who tried to breach their silent fortress. Yet here, in this kitchen, they were responding as if the music had been dormant inside them all along, waiting for the right key to unlock it. The kitchen had transformed into a sanctuary, achieving in minutes what years of therapy never could. Leo lifted his arms like an airplane, wobbling from side to side. Miles, with fierce concentration, attempted to copy Clara's swaying hips, his tiny body jerking out of sync but filled with a spirit that was breathtaking. She laughed with them. Not at them, her joy feeding theirs in a glorious, endless loop. "That's it, my little explorers," she whispered, kneeling again, her forehead nearly touching Miles's as she mirrored his stomp. He giggled louder this time, a pure, ringing sound that made her eyes sting. Leo rushed to her other side, clapping in time with the beat, and then all three of them were lost in a whirlwind of motion and laughter. She felt her chest tighten with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel so quickly, so fiercely. It was attachment. It was love. In only 2 weeks, she'd been searching for a crack in their shell, and she'd found it. It wasn't about hearing. It was about feeling. It was vibration, rhythm, movement, connection. They could feel it, and so could she. For the first time since she'd walked through the imposing doors of the Vance mansion, she knew these boys were not unreachable. They were simply waiting for the right rhythm to guide them out of the shadows. It was in the middle of this impromptu sacrament that Julian Vance walked in. He'd only intended to grab a financial report he'd left on the counter, his mind still tangled in the complex web of a multi-million-dollar merger. He stopped dead. The file slipped from his hand, landing on the marble floor with a soft thud he didn't even register. Leo and Miles were not withdrawn. They were not staring blankly at the walls. They were moving. They were laughing. Miles's head was thrown back in a posture of pure, unrestrained joy, his small hands still wrapped tightly around Clara's fingers, as if she were an anchor in a wonderful storm. Leo stumbled into her side, clutching her arm for balance, but a real, audible laugh was spilling from his mouth. The sound, the sight, hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. His breath hitched in his throat. His children were laughing. His sons, who had spent 5 years entombed in silence, were dancing clumsily in the middle of his kitchen, their tiny feet stomping in time to a song he hadn't heard since Eleanor was alive. His chest ached with something violent, something he had buried so deep he thought it was dead. It was hope, and it fucking hurt. He wanted to move, to step forward, to demand an explanation for this impossibility, but his feet were bolted to the floor. All he could do was stand there, rooted in shock, watching the miracle unfold. He didn't realize his hand had flown to his chest until he felt his fingers pressing against the sharp, spreading ache. The scene blurred, his mind refusing to process the data his eyes were sending. Clara twirled once more, then bent low to look into Miles's face, her smile radiant. Leo clapped again, then made a small, rudimentary motion with his hands, a flicker of a sign, and Miles followed suit, their eyes shining with a light Julian hadn't seen since the day they were born. Julian's throat tightened until it burned. He had never seen them like this. He had never allowed himself to believe they could look like this. For the first time in 5 years, there was life in their eyes, unfiltered, raw, and overwhelming. And at the center of it all was Clara May, the woman whose resume he'd barely glanced at, a woman who was now drawing something out of his children that no doctor, no therapist, no specialist had ever been able to find. He felt dizzy. The silence that had smothered his house, his life, had just been broken. Not by him, with all his power and wealth, but by her. Standing in the doorway, he could do nothing but stare, his chest heavy with shock, grief, and the flicker of a dangerous, long-forgotten hope. The next morning, Julian woke before dawn, his body restless, his mind a battlefield. He sat on the edge of his king-sized bed, elbows on his knees, head bowed, as if crushed by the weight of a single memory. Leo and Miles, laughing. He had replayed the scene 100 times, the image of them stumbling to a rhythm that vibrated through their small bodies. That memory should have been a balm, but instead, it left him profoundly shaken. For years, he had been conditioned by experts, by the grim prognoses of pediatric neurologists and grief counselors, to believe his son's isolation was a permanent state. Their connection to the world, he was told, would forever be fragile, a thing to be managed, not cured. And yet, in the space of a single song, the housekeeper, had shattered that diagnosis. It was exhilarating, yes, but it was also terrifying. It meant the solid ground of his grief, the rigid structure of his hopeless reality, was turning to quicksand beneath his feet. His chest tightened, his heart resisting the intrusion of this new, terrifying possibility. He paced his opulent bedroom, the plush carpet muffling his agitated steps. He was searching for a logical flaw, a way to dismiss what he'd seen as a fluke, a momentary aberration. But the image of their joy was lodged in him like a splinter, sharp and insistent. He found Clara in the kitchen. She was humming softly as she prepared breakfast, a sound so alien in that house it was almost jarring. Leo and Miles sat at the small table, their hands busy with a set of wooden blocks they usually ignored. But today, they weren't just holding them. They were tapping them against the wood, creating a clumsy, experimental rhythm. Julian's throat closed at the sight, but instead of acknowledging the beauty of it, he clung to the one thing that had always kept him steady: control. "Miss May," he said, his voice a blade slicing through the soft morning air. She glanced up, her calm expression instantly sharpening with awareness. "What precisely do you think you're doing with my children?" His tone was an accusation, as if she had violated some sacred, unspoken law of the house. Clara deliberately set down the knife she was holding, wiped her hands on a cloth, and faced him squarely. "I was giving them joy, Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice simple and direct. "They deserved it." Julian's jaw tightened. "They don't need your tricks. They need structure, therapy, predictable schedules. What you did yesterday, it wasn't treatment, it was reckless. His words were meant to be a verdict, a final judgment to restore order. But Clara didn't flinch. She leaned one hand against the counter, her posture as solid as stone, and met his glare without a flicker of doubt. "With all due respect, Mr. Vance, joy isn't reckless. It's the one thing they've been starved of." Her words struck him like a physical blow, because in the deepest, most fortified part of his soul, he knew she was right. He refused to let it show. The silence that followed was thin and crackling, charged with the electricity of unspoken truth. He tried to speak again, to reassert his authority, but the memory of his son's laughter rose unbidden, stealing the certainty from his voice. "You're overstepping," he finally managed, but the steel was gone, replaced by something brittle. Clara, sensing his faltering resolve, softened her tone but not her stance. "I'm not trying to replace their doctors. I don't pretend to have their knowledge, but I can see your sons as more than a diagnosis. They are children, Mr. Vance, children who are desperate for connection. Yesterday they let me in. That means something, whether you want to admit it or not." Julian swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was a man accustomed to deference, to having his will be the final word. Yet this woman's quiet conviction pierced through layers of armor he hadn't even known were there. He wanted to dismiss her as naive, a simple woman who didn't understand the complexities of their condition. But the image of Miles's small hand clutching hers, trusting her, refused to fade. It was a war inside his chest, his pride against a desperate longing, his carefully constructed grief against a terrifying new possibility. He drew in a breath to steady himself, but it came out ragged, betraying the conflict he could no longer control. Later that morning, Julian tried to bury himself in work. He locked the door to his office, spread financial projections across his mahogany desk, and stared at numbers that demanded his attention. But every time he picked up his pen, it hovered uselessly above the page. His thoughts kept dragging him back to the kitchen. He saw Miles's head thrown back in laughter, Leo's tiny, clapping hands, Clara's radiant smile as she guided them. His chest constricted with a toxic mix of admiration and resentment. He hated this feeling of vulnerability. He hated that someone else had achieved in a single moment what he, with all his wealth and resources, had failed to do in 5 years. And simmering beneath that resentment was the raw, terrifying truth. He wanted more of it. He wanted to see them laugh again. He wanted to hear those giggles that had shaken the very foundations of his silent world. But allowing that meant opening a door he had nailed shut the day Eleanor died. It meant risking hope, and hope was a cruel, vicious thing. If it broke, it would destroy what little was left of him. He rubbed his eyes in frustration, the pen clattering from his hand as he leaned back in his chair, lost in a war he couldn't win. When he finally emerged from his office hours later, the house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. This silence held an echo, an undercurrent of expectancy, as though the memory of laughter still lingered in the air. He found himself drawn to the living room, where Clara sat on the floor with Leo and Miles. They were simply stacking blocks. But what stopped Julian in his tracks was the way Leo, unprompted, reached out and tugged gently on Clara's sleeve, just to draw her gaze. She responded instantly, a warm smile spreading across her face as she helped him place the next block on their wobbly tower. Miles was leaning against her shoulder, his small body relaxed in a way Julian rarely saw, watching the construction with rapt attention. The sight rooted him to the spot. His sons, who so often shied away from physical contact, were leaning into her as if she were a source of gravity, a fixture of safety. A pang of something sharp and unfamiliar pierced him. Was it jealousy? Or was it shame that he wasn't the one they sought out? He turned away quickly, swallowing the lump in his throat, but the image was seared into his mind, undeniable proof that the woman he'd hired to clean his house was, in fact, rebuilding it from the inside out. And his fortress of grief had a crack in it. Life was seeping in. As the days bled into a week, the rigid routines of the Vance mansion began to dissolve. Clara seemed to possess a quiet magic, transforming the most mundane tasks into moments of connection. Folding laundry was no longer a chore. It became an impromptu puppet show. Socks became chattering characters with high-pitched voices, and freshly laundered shirts became superhero capes that she would ceremoniously drape over Leo's or Miles's shoulders. At first, the boys just watched, their expressions a mixture of puzzlement and fascination, but slowly, their lips would curl into tentative smiles, and their fingers would twitch, itching to snatch a sock puppet and join the show. What struck Julian, who watched these scenes unfold from the shadows of doorways, was her intentionality. She never pushed, she never forced their participation. She created an irresistible invitation and let them approach in their own time. "Mr. Sock says he's feeling very lonely," she would say, wiggling the sock puppet over a pile of towels. Leo's small hand would dart out to grab it, and Clara would laugh, a genuine, delighted sound that made him feel as if he'd just won an Olympic medal. Miles, never to be outdone, would shuffle closer and reach for his own fabric creature. The house, for so long oppressed by a heavy, mournful silence, was now punctuated by these small bursts of laughter. They startled Julian every time, like unexpected birdsong in a wasteland. Even sweeping the floors became a spectacle. It was no longer about dust, it was a race. Clara would hold the broom like a starting pistol and declare, "First one to the grandfather clock is the champion," and they would be off. Miles, still unsteady on his feet, would shuffle forward with grim determination, while Leo would dart ahead clumsily, their small feet thumping a joyful, awkward rhythm against the polished hardwood. Once, Julian stood in the doorway to the grand hall, arms crossed, trying to convince himself that this was chaos, a disruption to the order that was necessary for the boys' stability. But as he watched his sons, faces flushed with effort, collapse into a giggling heap on an antique Persian rug, he felt his stern facade crumble. Their laughter carried a rhythm that tugged at something deep inside him, a memory of a life he thought was gone forever. Eleanor had always teased him for being too serious, for building walls where she wanted to plant gardens. Seeing his sons wrestling playfully on the floor, clutching at Clara's legs as she pretended to have lost the race, he finally understood how starved the house, and he, had been for a little bit of beautiful mess. Even washing dishes, a task Julian had never once considered in his life, became a moment of wonder. Clara filled the deep farmhouse sink with suds, blowing into them until iridescent bubbles floated up into the air like a stream of liquid jewels. Miles let out a small sound, a cross between a squeak and an attempt at a word, as he pointed a chubby finger at a bubble hovering near the ceiling. Leo reached out, clapping his hands together to pop it, then laughed so hard he nearly toppled over. "Catch them! Catch them!" Clara encouraged, her voice alive with an energy that was as infectious as the music she so often played. Julian, standing in the hallway just out of sight, pressed a hand against the doorframe, his jaw tight. A fierce, complicated pride swelled in him. Pride in his sons for finding their voices, their joy, and a grudging pride in Clara for having the wisdom to coax it out of them. But tangled with that pride was the sharp, jagged edge of guilt. This should have been Eleanor. It should have been her laughter echoing with the boys, her hands covered in soap suds, her magic filling the kitchen. Instead, it was Clara. The thought was as painful as it was undeniable. Leo and Miles began to trail after Clara like a pair of ducklings. If she went to the laundry room, they followed. If she headed to the library to dust, they were right behind her. Their once hesitant steps were now purposeful. She'd bend to pick up a basket of linens, and Leo would toddle over, pulling at the edge until she let him carry a single, small pillowcase in his arms like a priceless treasure. Miles would follow close behind, murmuring broken syllables that were nonsense to anyone else, but carried a clear intent. "Da," he'd mumble, pointing at the basket, and Clara would immediately crouch down to his level. "Yes, Miles, that's your pillowcase. Can you try to say pillowcase?" He would stumble over the word, his little face scrunched with concentration, and Clara would beam and ruffle his hair as if he'd just recited Shakespeare. Julian watched this from the upstairs landing, a hidden observer unable to tear himself away. His sons were trying to speak, not because a therapist was prompting them with flashcards, but because she had given them a reason to. His chest tightened painfully. He desperately wanted to rush down, to kneel beside them, to celebrate every clumsy attempt. But a wall of guilt froze him in place. He had spent 5 years drowning in work, convincing himself their silence was an unbreakable fortress. To join in now, when she was the one who had finally found the key, felt like a betrayal. It felt like theft. But Clara never treated it as her personal victory. Every time one of the boys reached for her, she would gently redirect their attention back to each other. "Leo, give Miles the blue block. Miles, can you show Leo your drawing?" She wasn't just building a bond with them. She was rebuilding the bond between them, and Julian saw the change. The twins, once locked in their own separate, silent worlds, now began to share. A block passed from one small hand to another. A giggle answered by a second giggle, a clumsy, emerging language bouncing between them. Julian leaned against the wall, his chest a battlefield. The pride in their progress fought a bitter war with the haunting whisper that this should not be happening without Eleanor. He could hear her voice in his memory, her laugh as they decorated the nursery, her teasing promise that their children would be loud and unstoppable. She would never see this. She would never hear their first broken words. And the wound of that truth split open, wider and more painful than ever before. Every laugh he heard, every milestone he witnessed, was a beautiful, heartbreaking reminder of all they had lost. Late one evening, long after the boys had been tucked into bed and the mansion had sunk back into its familiar hush, Clara lingered in the formal living room. She was tidying the toys the twins had scattered across the carpet, a happy mess that was still a novelty in this house. As she reached for a small wooden car that had rolled beneath a heavy sideboard, her eyes caught a glint of silver high on one of the top shelves, almost hidden in the shadows. Curious, she stood on her toes, stretched her arm, and carefully pulled down a heavy frame, its edges dulled by a thin layer of dust. She wiped the glass with the hem of her sleeve, and her breath caught. It was a photograph of a younger Julian, smiling in a way she had never seen before, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. His hand was entwined with that of a radiant woman whose eyes sparkled with a fierce, joyful light. Eleanor. Even without having ever met her, Clara felt she knew her from the ghost she'd left behind, in the silence of the mansion and the permanent storm in Julian's gaze. For a long moment she simply studied the photo, touched by the love captured within that silver frame. Quietly, she decided against returning it to its dusty hiding place. Instead, she chose a lower shelf, one at the twins' eye level. Some instinct told her they deserved this. They deserved to know the face of the woman who gave them life, to understand that their mother wasn't just an absence, but had once been a vibrant, smiling presence. The effect the next morning was immediate and profound. Leo, wandering through the living room, stopped short in front of the photo. He tilted his head, his brow furrowed as if trying to place the familiar curve of the woman's smile. Clara, sitting nearby, watched without a word, giving him the space to discover this on his own. After a moment, he raised a tentative finger and tapped the glass. Then he turned, a look of urgency on his face, and tugged on his brother's shirt. Miles toddled closer, squinting at the image. The two of them stood there in silence, their small shoulders brushing. Then Leo, with a visible, concentrated effort, lifted his hands and shaped a clumsy sign. Mama. It was imperfect, hesitant, but unmistakable. Clara's chest constricted, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She crouched beside them, her voice a hushed, warm whisper. Yes, sweetheart. That's your mama. Miles's little fingers fumbled to copy the gesture, his movements messy, but the intent was crystal clear. Both boys stared at the picture, and Clara reached out, resting a hand gently on each of their backs. She was so beautiful, wasn't she? The boys didn't answer, but a softness entered their expressions, as if some piece of their soul recognized this fundamental connection, even without memory. When Julian entered the room moments later, the sight stopped him cold. His sons, standing before the photograph he had deliberately hidden away, their small hands raised in the unsteady shape of a word he had never dared to teach them. For a full second, his lungs forgot how to draw air. He had buried Eleanor's memory so deeply, convinced he was protecting them from a sorrow they couldn't comprehend. Seeing her face out in the open, and worse, seeing his sons reach for her, felt like a physical violation, a wound torn open. "What are you doing?" His voice came out harsher than he intended, a raw sound of accusation masking the agony twisting inside him. Clara turned, her expression calm, though her eyes held a deep understanding of the storm she had unleashed. "They found her picture," she said softly. "They knew. They knew who she was before I said a word." Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. A hot surge of anger rose in him, not at her, but at his own powerlessness. "They don't understand," he snapped. "They don't need this." But even as the words left his mouth, his gaze betrayed him, drawn back to his sons. Leo turned at the sound of his father's harsh voice. He looked at Julian, then back at the photo, lifted his hands again, and repeated the sign, more deliberately this time. "Mama." The word he had feared to even think had taken form in their tiny hands, and it shattered him. He tried to look away, to retreat behind the armor he had worn for 5 years, but his body betrayed him. His throat burned. His eyes stung. And for the first time since the day Eleanor died, he felt the hot, terrifying prick of tears. He had not cried at her funeral. He had stood stoic and stone-faced, convinced that holding himself together was his only path to survival. Now, seeing his children name her, claim her, the dam finally broke. His knees buckled as if the weight of his unshed grief suddenly became too much to bear. He crouched beside them, his hands trembling. "Yes," he whispered, the single word breaking on his tongue. That's Mama." Leo's face lit up at the confirmation. He pressed his hand against the glass, while Miles leaned against Julian's shoulder, murmuring syllables that were slurred but full of meaning. The moment should have destroyed him, but instead it felt like something else. It felt like the lancing of a wound. It was the beginning of a healing he had never thought possible. For the first time, he was sharing Eleanor with them, not as a ghost to be hidden, but as a vital part of their story. Clara stayed quiet, a silent witness to a scene she had set in motion but could not control. She saw the war raging inside Julian, grief against love, guilt against release. But she also saw the first crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. Her decision to bring Eleanor's memory into the light had been pure instinct, but now she realized how essential it was. The boys needed their mother, even as a memory, and Julian needed to see that remembering her didn't have to mean drowning in sorrow. It could mean learning to breathe again. She spoke softly, her words chosen with care. "They'll always know she loved them. That's what matters, Mr. Vance, not how much it hurts." He didn't answer, but his silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of denial. It was the silence of a man who had just been forced to feel everything he had tried so hard to bury. His hand lingered on Miles's back, a trembling anchor that told her he was finally holding on not just to grief but to his children, too. What do you think is the bravest thing a person can do when they're grieving? Is it to hold on, or is it to let go? We'd love to read your thoughts. This story is just getting to its heart, so if you're with us, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. One rainy afternoon, with the mansion feeling especially heavy under the gray sky, Clara gathered her courage. She was about to reveal a secret she'd been keeping for weeks. Julian had retreated to his office, but his focus was fractured, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the boys. When he finally came downstairs, he froze at the sight in the living room. Clara was kneeling on the carpet, a worn notebook open beside her. The pages were covered in scribbles, drawings of hands, arrows, and repeated words. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice a tightrope between suspicion and curiosity. Clara looked up, her expression calm, but her eyes alight with a nervous determination. "I've been learning something. For them," she said simply. She turned to the twins, who were watching her with rapt attention. Slowly, with deliberate care, she lifted her hands and shaped them into a sign. Play. Her lips formed the word as her fingers moved, her expression radiating a clear invitation. Leo's eyes widened in immediate recognition. Miles leaned forward, his brows furrowed in concentration. They had seen therapists use signs before, but it had always felt clinical, like a test. This felt like a gift. Julian stepped further into the room, silent. "What are you doing?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, stripped of its earlier edge. Clara didn't answer him directly. Instead, she shaped another word. Happy. She exaggerated the upward sweep of her hands, then placed them gently against her own chest. Happy, she mouthed softly. The boys blinked, then tried to mimic the motion. Their small fingers were clumsy, their gestures imprecise, but the effort was a thing of beauty. "That's right," Clara encouraged, her voice thick with pride. "Yes, Leo, yes, Miles, that's happy." Leo let out a faint giggle, and Miles's lips moved, trying to echo the word aloud. Something twisted inside Julian. He had paid a fortune to specialists, an army of experts who insisted progress would be a slow, clinical crawl measured in millimeters on a chart. Yet here was Clara, with no degree, no formal training beyond her late-night studies, building a bridge to his sons on their own terms. He tried to dismiss it, to tell himself it was just mimicry, but he couldn't deny the brilliant light in their eyes. The twins leaned closer, eager for more. Clara introduced another sign, her movements slower, more reverent. Love. She crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze soft. "Love," she whispered, as if entrusting them with a sacred secret. Miles copied her first, clumsily pressing his arms against his small chest, his face breaking into a radiant smile when she nodded her approval. Noah hesitated, his lip caught between his teeth, before he too attempted the gesture. His arms were awkward, his fingers tangled, but when he managed it, he let out a tiny, triumphant laugh. "That's beautiful," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced at Julian, and their eyes met. He saw no arrogance in her gaze, no demand for recognition. He saw only a quiet, profound devotion that shook him to his core. She had stayed up night after night, poring over books and videos, not because it was her job, but because she cared. She had given his children a gift he had never found the courage to offer them himself. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been so consumed with protecting them from disappointment that he had never even tried to learn their language. A hot, suffocating shame burned in his chest. For the first time, Julian found himself unable to remain a spectator. He walked forward, drawn by an invisible force, and sat down on the edge of the rug. The boys noticed immediately, their faces lighting up. Leo tugged at his sleeve, babbling with intent. Miles reached for Julian's hand, pulling it closer, inviting him in. Julian's mouth went dry. His hands, so accustomed to the cool authority of a pen or the weight of a legal document, felt clumsy and foreign. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, his throat tight. Clara's eyes met his again, her gaze calm but insistent. "Try," she said softly. "Just one." He swallowed, his chest rising and falling too quickly. But then he looked at his sons, at their expectant faces, and he lifted his hands. They shook as he formed the shape he had just seen her make, a simple, powerful sign. His lips parted, and his voice was barely a whisper as he mouthed the word. "Papa." The reaction was instantaneous. Leo gasped, clapping his hands against his chest before signing something back, a rapid, excited jumble. Miles laughed, a pure, ringing sound, his arms moving in an enthusiastic, jerky attempt to mirror the sign. Both of them turned toward him, their joy so unrestrained it was like a physical force, as if they had been waiting 5 long years for this single moment. Julian's chest cracked open. He had never understood the power of a single word until now, especially one carried by hands instead of sound. "Papa," Leo murmured, the syllables broken but audible, and Julian's heart nearly stopped. Miles leaned forward and hugged his father's arm, his small body warm and insistent. For the first time, Julian didn't feel like a warden or a spectator in their lives. He felt like a part of them. The word, as trembling as it was, had wrapped around him with a force stronger than any wall he had ever built. His sons were speaking to him, and he was finally listening. Hope had begun to take root in Julian's chest like a cautious flame, but with it came a deep, gnawing unease. Every new sign from his sons, every burst of laughter filled him with a mixture of awe and terror. He wanted to believe it was real, but a lifetime of discipline and skepticism held him captive. He needed proof. He needed validation from the world he understood, the world of experts and data. So when Dr. Alistair Finch, the esteemed pediatric neurologist who had followed the boys since birth, scheduled a progress check, Julian saw it as his chance. This would be the moment he could finally anchor the fragile hope that was threatening to capsize him. The morning of the visit, he was a wreck, pacing the living room, rehearsing how he would present Leo and Miles's new abilities. Clara moved quietly around him, sensing his anxiety. "They'll just show him who they are," she said gently, but Julian cut her off with a curt, "We'll see." His entire body was braced for either vindication or devastating disappointment. When Dr. Finch arrived, his presence filled the room with the cool, sterile authority Julian had once found comforting. Now, it felt like a looming judgment. The doctor adjusted his glasses, made notes on a clipboard, and greeted the twins with a polite but detached warmth. Julian crouched beside his sons, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Go on," he whispered, his voice almost a plea. "Show Papa, show Dr. Finch." At first, Leo lifted his hands, hesitantly shaping a sign for ball. Julian's chest surged with pride, but the moment Leo noticed the doctor's intense, analytical gaze, he froze, his little fingers faltering. Miles, sensing the shift in energy, shrank back, burying his face in Clara's side. Julian's throat tightened. "It's okay," he urged, his voice too forceful this time. "Do it again. Show him." But the boys only clung tighter to Clara, their bodies rigid with the discomfort of being specimens under a microscope. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Finch cleared his throat softly, jotting something down. "Mr. Vance," he began, his tone measured and patient. "Children at this stage often mimic gestures during play. It doesn't necessarily indicate meaningful communicative progress." Julian's head snapped toward him, his pulse roaring in his ears. "They're communicating," he insisted, his voice sharp with desperation. "They're using signs. They're laughing. They're engaging. They've never done these things before." The doctor sighed, his expression a careful mask of professional sympathy. "What you're describing is certainly encouraging on a personal level, but it is anecdotal. We cannot equate emotional responses with developmental breakthroughs. I caution you against the dangers of false hope. It can be damaging, both for you and for them." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile structure of hope Julian had allowed himself to build. He glanced at his sons, now silent and completely withdrawn, and the ache in his chest sharpened into a hot spike of humiliation. He had paraded them like prize ponies, desperate for an expert's approval, and they had failed the test. As Dr. Finch continued his sterile assessment, Julian's emotions ignited into a storm he couldn't contain. Humiliation twisted into anger. And that anger, searching for a target, landed on the one person who had made him vulnerable enough to hope in the first place. "This is your doing!" he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a shard of glass. Clara, who had been stroking Miles's back, looked up in shock. "My doing?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes wide with hurt. Julian stood abruptly, his hands trembling with a rage he couldn't direct at his sons or the doctor. "You've filled their heads with illusions, parlor tricks. You get them to laugh, to mimic you, and you convince me they're changing. But when it matters, when it's put to the test, they collapse. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've sold me on false hope." The venom in his tone was born of his own self-loathing, but Clara bore the full force of it. The room froze. The twins clung to her as if sensing the emotional violence of the storm that had just broken. Clara rose slowly, her movements gentle as she reassured the boys, then turned her unwavering gaze to Julian. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried the unshakable weight of conviction. "Hope is not an illusion, Julian," she said firmly, using his first name for the first time. "It's the only thing that's been keeping them alive in this house." She tapped her own chest softly, then gestured toward the twins. "Do you think reports and charts are going to raise them? Do you think statistics will teach them how to trust, how to laugh, how to look you in the eye and know they are loved? No. What they need is someone who believes in them. What they need is faith." Her words struck deeper than any medical assessment ever could. But Julian's pride, wounded and raw, wouldn't let him yield. His jaw tightened, his silence a wall, turning the space between them into a chasm. Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes dimming with the pain of his rejection. She gathered the boys closer, her body a shield, and her message was clear. If he would not believe, she would carry that burden for all of them. The rest of the day passed in a haze of frigid distance. Julian retreated to his office, drowning himself in documents he couldn't read, his mind replaying the confrontation in a torturous loop of shame and anger. He told himself he had only been rational, that illusions would destroy them all. But deep down, he knew he had lashed out because her faith terrified him more than the doctor's doubt ever could. Clara, for her part, moved through the mansion with a quietness that was heavier than any silence before it. She still cared for the boys with infinite patience, but her own laughter was gone. Noah and Ethan felt the shift, clinging to her more tightly, their eyes searching for reassurance that the world they had just begun to trust had not been shattered completely. By nightfall, the house felt colder than it had in years, the fragile warmth of the past few weeks extinguished by one man's pride and another's fear. The fracture between them was no longer a crack. It was a canyon. Days of tension stretched across the mansion like a shroud, smothering the fragile sparks of life that had begun to ignite. Julian and Clara moved around each other like ghosts, their conversations limited to clipped necessities. The silence that returned to the house was different now. It was sharp and angry, laced with the memory of their confrontation. The twins felt it most keenly. Their giggles became softer, rarer, as if they were afraid to disturb the cold, heavy air. They clung to Clara with a quiet desperation, their eyes darting to their father whenever he entered a room, sensing the chasm they could not name. Julian hated himself for it. Every night, alone in his vast, empty bed, he replayed his cruel words, the accusations he had hurled in a moment of humiliation. He had wounded not just her, but the two small boys who had placed their fragile trust in her hands. Pride and shame were a potent poison, and they kept him paralyzed. It was a Thursday evening when everything shifted again. Dinner had been another tense, silent affair. Afterward, as Clara was clearing the dishes, the twins sat listlessly nearby. Suddenly, Leo's eyes lit up. He spotted her canvas bag on a chair, half open, with the small, battered speaker peeking out. Recognition sparked in his gaze. Without a moment's hesitation, he slid from his chair, toddled over, and pulled it free. Miles followed, his curiosity piqued. Leo, with an almost ceremonial care, placed the speaker on the kitchen floor as if it were a sacred object. He fumbled with the button for a second, then pressed it. Music spilled out, a little distorted, but alive. It was the same Aretha Franklin song. Miles's face broke into a grin. Before Clara could react, both boys began stomping their feet in time with the rhythm, their movements clumsy but filled with an undeniable, joyful intent. They turned their heads toward her, their eyes wide and expectant, their bodies bouncing in an invitation she couldn't possibly refuse. For a moment she hesitated, her heart tight with the memory of Julian's accusations. But then Leo reached for her hands, his fingers clapping to the beat, and Miles echoed him with a high-pitched laugh. The hesitation dissolved. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped into the circle of joy the boys had created. She bent low, sweeping her hands theatrically as she spun, stomping her own feet to match theirs. Their laughter erupted instantly, bubbling up like a spring that had been blocked and was now free. Leo squealed, bouncing harder, while Miles tried to copy her spin, his tiny arms flailing. "That's it, babies," she laughed, her voice trembling with the sheer relief of feeling them come alive again. The fracture in the household seemed to mend in those moments, as if the music itself had the power to knit the broken pieces back together. Upstairs, in his office, Julian had sworn he would not interfere. But then he heard it. The faint thumping of a beat. Laughter. The unmistakable sound of life spilling back into his house. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He descended the stairs slowly, the knot in his chest tightening with each step, until he stood once more in the kitchen doorway. The sight stole his breath. Leo and Miles were stomping in unison, their faces alight with pure glee, while Clara spun in their midst like a beacon. For an instant, the sharp pang of guilt returned. But then, something extraordinary happened. Both boys turned and saw him standing there. And together, their little hands rose in unsteady gestures, signing clumsily but with perfect clarity. "Dance, Papa." Julian's heart lurched so violently he thought his knees might give out. They had never invited him in like this. Never. Their eyes were locked on him, shining with open, hopeful expectation. Panic seized him. What if he looked foolish? What if he couldn't do it? But their hands kept signing, their gazes unwavering. Clara turned too, her face soft, silently urging him forward. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of 5 years of grief trying to hold him back. But then he took a step, and another. He stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the kitchen. He raised his arms, awkward and stiff, and swayed. His movements were clumsy, but his son's reaction erased every ounce of his self-consciousness. They shrieked with delight, stomping harder, their laughter echoing off the walls until Julian could no longer hold himself back. He crouched low, mimicking their stomps, spinning with them, letting himself get lost in the glorious, healing silliness of the moment. He wasn't the billionaire, or the widower, or the man defined by failure. For the first time, in the middle of his kitchen floor, surrounded by the sound of soul music and the laughter of his children, he was simply Papa. Sleep had become a stranger to Julian, but this night felt different. The dance in the kitchen had settled something in him. But it had also stirred something else, something deeper that remained unfinished. Hours after the house had fallen silent, he found himself in his study, drawn not by work, but by a pull from the past. He sat at his desk and reached for a drawer he hadn't opened in over 5 years. It resisted, stuck with disuse, but he pulled it open. Inside lay a single envelope, its edges yellowed, sealed but never mailed. He knew what it was. A letter to Eleanor, written in a moment of pure despair 2 weeks after her death, when the silence from the nursery was a physical torment, and his sons felt like strangers he could never reach. He held the letter for a long time before standing. His feet carried him, almost of their own accord, down the hall to Clara's room. He hesitated at her door, the letter a confession in his hand. He knocked gently. A moment later she opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of him, unshaven, exhausted, holding his deepest wound between his fingers. "I wrote this," he said, his voice raw. "For Eleanor, a long time ago. I never sent it." She nodded once and stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He handed her the envelope. She sat on the edge of her bed and carefully opened it. As her eyes scanned the pages, William felt stripped bare. He had never shown it to anyone. It held his darkest fear, that he didn't know how to be a father without her, that he was terrified he would fail their children. When she finished, Clara's hands were trembling slightly. She folded the letter with reverence and looked up at him, her voice soft but certain. "She would have been so proud of you, Julian." He swallowed hard, unable to believe it. But she continued, "Not for the empire you built, not for the money. She would have been proud because you're still here. You stayed. You tried. You're trying." She rose and stepped closer, placing the letter gently back in his hand. Then she reached out and cupped his face, a gesture so tender it startled him. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "You were never supposed to be enough on your own," she whispered. "No one is." In that moment, he let her see it all. The pain, the fear, the failure. She didn't offer pity. She offered recognition. He told her about the night he wrote the letter, how he'd sat outside the nursery door, paralyzed by his son's cries, convinced he should give them up. And she just listened, her presence a quiet anchor in his storm. "I'm so sorry you went through that alone," she murmured when he finished. No one had ever said that to him, and hearing it from her, something inside him finally loosened its death grip. As he stood to leave, he looked from the letter to her. "Thank you," he said, the 2 words carrying the weight of a lifetime. He returned to his study and placed the letter back in the drawer. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder that healing didn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like staying, and sometimes it looked like handing someone the most broken part of yourself and trusting them not to flinch. The morning carried the delicate scent of spring, a promise of renewal. It had been a long, hard winter. Clara had planned a simple activity in the garden, a trail of vibrant ribbons tied to small stakes pushed into the soft earth, a colorful path for the boys to follow. "Walk to the colors," she signed. "One step, then another." Miles went first, teetering slightly. Leo followed, more cautious, glancing back at Clara for reassurance. She just smiled. They stumbled, they fell, they got up, and they giggled. Their laughter was clearer now, their voices finding shape. Miles pointed at a bird and squealed a sound that was almost its name. Julian watched from the porch, his hand gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. This wasn't therapy. This was play. This was life. He stepped down from the porch, drawn forward against his will. As he neared the path, Leo turned, looked straight at him, and raised his hands. "Come, Papa." The invitation was so pure, so direct, it knocked the breath from his lungs. It wasn't a plea. It was a welcome. And Julian, the man who had been frozen in time for 5 years, finally moved. He didn't walk. He ran. He ran like a father desperate to meet his children where their joy lived. He knelt on the damp earth, arms open, and gathered them both into his chest. A sob escaped him, raw and uncontained, a sound of grief and gratitude so profound it shook his entire body. The boys didn't flinch. They leaned in closer, their small arms tightening around his neck, as if they understood that this, too, was the sound of love. Messy, loud, imperfect, human. He kissed their foreheads, signing love over and over, not because they didn't know, but because he needed to finally say it. Clara stood back, her hand pressed to her chest, tears shimmering in her eyes. She was a witness, not a participant. This moment was not hers. And yet without her, it would never have happened. Julian looked up at her over his sons' heads, their gazes locking. There were no words for the gratitude he felt, but she saw it. It lived in the way he held his children, in the way his pride had finally shattered to make way for something far more sacred. Belonging. Months later, the Vance mansion was unrecognizable. The halls echoed with laughter. Toys were scattered like happy landmines, and music was always playing somewhere. Clara was no longer the housekeeper. She was the heart of the home. She was family. On a warm summer evening, Julian hosted a small gathering in the garden. It wasn't a lavish party, just a few friends and neighbors. Leo and Miles ran across the grass, their capes flying behind them, stopping to proudly sign words to the guests. Julian found Clara standing under the old oak tree. He handed her a glass of lemonade. "You brought them back to me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You brought me back to them." Before she could reply, the boys came barreling toward them, faces smeared with cake, and tugged on their hands. And in that simple, persistent tug, they all moved toward a blanket spread on the grass. The 4 of them sat in a close circle under the fading light, sharing cookies, their laughter mixing with the chirping of the crickets. The definition of family had rewritten itself. It wasn't bound by blood alone, but by presence, by the courage to show up in the wreckage and build something new. Julian had once thought his mansion was a monument to his success. Now he knew its true value was in the living that happened inside it. The real wealth was not in his bank account, but in this messy, beautiful, breathing love. Clara had never demanded a place in their lives. She had simply filled the empty spaces with so much light that, in the end, she had become home. What part of this story touched your heart the most? We truly love to hear from you in the comments. If this video moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. It means the world to us. Each story we share here takes days of care, reflection, and love to bring to life, always with you in mind. Your support helps us keep this space alive with more stories that inspire, heal, and connect. Thank you for being here with us, and we hope to see you in the next one.